What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? Today, we are going to be talking with Derek Lambert from Myth Vision. And, Derek and I, we've talked a lot in the past. I feel like we're pretty good acquaintances, friends, if I might say. And, Derek, do you want to just tell everybody where they can find you and everything like that?
You can find me in the third heaven. And I have ascended past that at one point, but I was on drugs. And so Myth Vision Podcast is a YouTube channel that I have, and it's like exploring all sorts of crazy stuff. There's probably something you like. You may not like everything that I do, but there's probably something on there that you would watch and be like, oh, that's actually interesting. Not so much that, but that, whatever it might be. We explore mythologies. We love diving into Christianity because I was a hardcore fundamentalist Christian for many years. And of course, me and John have a lot of that in common. So if you're interested in exploring this stuff and also seeing it from like a naturalist point of view, like what is the phenomena of religion and how do we explain it from a naturalist worldview? How did it evolve? All that fun stuff, man, that's what I love to get into. So John, I'm excited and I'm thankful you invited me on your show.
Oh yeah, no problem. I mean, I'm very interested because I literally don't understand the position of thinking that Jesus was a historical figure. And just from everything that I've read and all the research that I've done, like I genuinely don't understand how somebody can come to the historicist position. Mm-hmm. So I'm always looking to have these kinds of conversations, which, on Tuesday of, I believe this week was when I'm going to release this. I actually had a discussion with a guy named Jordan from Reason and Doubt. And he explained why, he thought that the James mentioned by Paul and Josephus was an apostle and was a brother of Jesus, mm-hmm. like a blood relative. Right. And I don't know if that's on your list today.
No. Not at all. Not at all. In fact, I know how. Well, I've studied this stuff. I've researched, and scholars like Bart Ehrman and those who debate back and forth and stuff have like strawmanned mythicist position. And I'm very upfront as someone who thinks there was probably a historical Jesus. What we can know about him, this is the guesswork. But as far as there being a person, right? I came from the mythicist position, and I started thinking there's probably a guy, and we'll get into some of that. But I know that the real discussion needs to evolve, not around Josephus, not around Suetonius and Tacitus and later works and Celsus and whatever. None of that, not even the Gospels. We really just have to talk about Paul. How we understand Paul, is going to make the difference in terms of where we're going with it. You know what I mean?
I couldn't agree with you more. Hard agree on this. I think Paul is really where the discussion's at. I do want to implore everybody while I get situated here in my seat. I do want to implore everybody to definitely go and check out Myth Vision. I've been on Myth Vision a few times. It's always a great experience, and definitely consider becoming a patron of Derek here, because Derek, I do believe you're doing this full time, aren't you?
I am now.
Yeah. So definitely go if you like this kind of content in particular, which I know that some people on my channel do. Definitely go check out Derek if you haven't already. But we're going to be talking today about why Derek came to the historicist position, because like I was explaining before we hit record, I literally don't understand why some people still hold on to the historicist position. Like, I get why New Testament scholars do, and even the somewhat critical scholars like Bart Ehrman and others of his ilk. I understand why they do, but I guess I'm failing to understand why their evidence convinces people. And I'm excited to talk about Paul today with you.
Yeah.
So let's start off. Maybe you could, say what was the one thing, or was there one thing that kind of flipped you from mythicist to historicist?
It wasn't one thing. It's almost like when you're a Christian and you start to doubt, and then you're like, hold on. There's a few things I never really thought about, and which one, from an honest perspective, backing up, makes the most sense to me. And it's all a subjective observation. So if you ask me, who's the guy? Tell me, give me the evidence. Like, what do you mean? You know what I mean? Like, I'm not that kind of historicist. I'm not the guy who's going to tell you this is what Jesus did on Wednesday. He was this guy, and we know. Like, no. I'm a minimal. I think there was a guy. The evidence looks like that to me now, and I think it's about how you're looking at it and what you're trying to factor in as evidence. Because to me, just pointing up front, there are things that are posited in Richard Carrier's work, and of course. A lot of Robert Price actually uses some of the stuff that Richard says, but he also has other things that he is using in his material to come to the mythicist position. And as I've interviewed countless times with Richard Carrier, I love him. Did you see my top 10 video, by the way, on the top 10 dying and rising gods?
It's on my list.
You're going to want to see it. I use Richard's article actually to produce that video. So I love Richard, even if I think there was probably a Jesus, and he knows this. We talked in California. So it was a couple different things. For me, the heavenly celestial realm concept for Jesus, crucifixion, birth, the whole nine. Like if I had literature in Paul that just outright said this, there wouldn't be a problem. I think it's easy to assume and assert like crucifixions happened on earth all the time. If we had more data that crucifixions were happening in the heavens all over the place, things like that. In other literature, in other Jewish literature, that I knew that, hey, there's people being born in the heavens, they're being crucified in the heavens, they're under the law in the heavens, which we'll get into some of Paul's literature. There's some things for me, right? I looked at it and I said, hold on, like on the minimal historicity route, some of these passages in Paul's works would work even if you granted some of the interpretations that mythicists have. In fact, well-known, Richard Carrier and Dr. Bob, they say like a lot of these interpretations where we say this is what it means, or interpolations or whatever, come from non-mythicists to make their point. They actually think there probably was a guy. And so factoring that in, I'm like, okay, started looking at it and I said, wow, let's start looking at some of the pericope in Paul to come to maybe like what we think is going on. So I brought a little PowerPoint visual so you and me can go through Paul. Is that cool?
Yeah, that's fine. Definitely.
Okay, let me see if I can bring it up. It's better just to be able to go through what he actually says here than me speculating, you speculating, whatever. And just at the end of the day, I'm not dogmatic. Like I'm really not. So I just want everyone to know. And I honestly encourage people not to be. I want to bridge that gap between people who are mythicists and historicists and not be dogmatic one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
That's my whole like goal, because I saw so much of that when I was mythicist, historicist flinging mud, mythicist flinging mud. Anyway, I just put that slide up.
Oh, there we go. Sorry. I didn't realize I was going to have to add it in there. I'm kind of new to the StreamYard sort of experience, so I'm getting there.
StreamYard's awesome, and you can bring the comments up. People love it, and they get to interact with you more. So I figure I bring up some pericope. I'm sure you might have others you would love to dive into, and I'd be happy to talk about anything, dude, because me nor you, I think we're on the same team overall. It's just here is this one thing that we're interpreting the data a bit differently. I was particularly mythicist, but now I'm more historicist. And so I wanted to start in the creed, right? Everybody knows this creed. Are we on the same page in saying Paul wrote the seven?
Wrote the seven?
The seven authentic letters that are Paul?
Oh, yes.
So we're on the same page of consensus scholarship on that. And
yeah.
Okay. And then do you think that Paul's creed, I mean, we don't know this with certainty, but like, do you at least grant this is like from Paul and Paul's actually saying these words and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think the only excuse me. I think the oh shit. I think the only
you hit the doobie too hard.
No, I had a drink of my monster drink, and it went down the wrong pipe. No, I think the only problem that I have with the Pauline Creed is the 500 brothers, because I mean, I don't think that's really all that important to, I think, what we're going to talk about. But the because if I understand like the analysis of it, it's just one spelling error away from it being that Jesus appeared over Pentateuch rather than appearing to 500 brothers or 500 people or whatever. Right. So I mean, other than that, I don't have a problem with it.
Yeah, I'm with you. Like, this is a huge problem. I figure we might as well have common ground as we're discussing differences. Like a big problem is if it said 500, why the hell don't the Gospels mention this? You would think that would be a flexing point in one of the Gospels to say, and he appeared to 500. Like, come on, man. Like, anyway, I have my like bones I pick with this, and I'm thinking to myself, was this really in Paul? I don't know with any certainty, but let's assume Paul actually writes this and stuff. And so I brought the pericope up. For I handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn had received. And I think that's this received, we would agree, is the visionary Christ, that Paul is receiving a message from Jesus after he's resurrected, which means you and me, this is in Paul's head.
I'm so glad that we can agree to that, because I've heard so many people say, well, no, this is about previous Christians telling him these things.
Right.
And so I'm glad that we can agree with that.
Yeah. And this is, to me, this is really clear. Paul's talking about what he received in a vision, or at least in his, whatever you want to call it, experience, that Christ died for our sins. And it may even be from scripture, as he says, in accordance with the scriptures. So here's this guy reading scriptures like he's reading some type of fortune cookie, and he's discovered that Jesus died somehow for our sins. And he's talking to the people in Corinth. And he says, and he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500, blah, 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 appeared. Most of them who are still alive, right? Though some died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. For I am the least of the apostles, unfit to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. So my question is, just to make sure we're on the same page, or at least discussing this pericope, this is Paul's talking about Christ after. This is his resurrection message that Christ has revealed to Paul, and Paul is conveying, hey, he appeared to Cephas, he appeared to the 12. Do you think that he appeared to Cephas before Paul, according to Paul's creed here?
I mean, I do, but I mean, so the important part to this for me is the according to the scriptures part, which in Greek it says kata tas graphos. I don't know how to pronounce it in Greek, but it's according to the scriptures, which is similar. That's similar in phrase to the tacked on titles to the Gospels, like according to Matthew, according to Mark. So this is the source for the information at the very top is the scriptures, and not any like historical sourcing. But I do think that that Cephas was or Cephas, however, it was the first one to receive visions, or at least as far as Paul knows, Cephas is the first one to receive visions from this Christ.
Before Paul. I mean, obviously, last of all me. And of course, he flexes. I've done more than all of, Paul's the most humble guy of them all. Anyway, I just want to make sure we're on the same page, because I think 1 Corinthians 15, he's explaining after Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, this is what he received. And then I want to get to this 1 Corinthians 11 just to ask you to explain what you think is going on here. Even if you say it's ambiguous, because most of the time I think that's probably what has been said in the past, just to take a jab. For I received from the Lord what I also handed on to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was handed over, took a loaf of bread, and when gave thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body that is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, he took the cup also after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." Now, I get it. There's no person being named. There's no place being named. I understand that. I'm with you. This is wild. I mean, it's ambiguous. It's very difficult. But if you were to take a jab at what this is saying or what is going on here, what would be your jab?
Well, I think what's going on here is that this visionary Christ gave Paul this vision of this ritualistic supper, or this ritualistic meal that Christians are now supposed to do, and he has all the symbology and everything like that there. And then at the very end, when it says you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes, kind of makes me think that he has not come yet, or he is yet to come in that way. So
that sounded really like gross, by the way.
No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, I know. My channel is all about innuendos, so
I'm just playing with you. So, okay, I get it. Like, Jesus hasn't actually appeared yet, according to that kind of interpretation there, until he comes. I mean, for me, I think this could be like the parousia, the expectation of the Lord to come. For me, I wanted to ask, is this like, do you think that, and I'm speculating here into the mythicist mind, because I was a mythicist, trying to think here, is this Jesus in heaven? Like presenting this to Paul in a vision? Is he in heaven drinking heavenly, or breaking heavenly bread? And who is he speaking to in heaven when he says, like, this is my body that is for you, this is in remembrance of me? Like, is it heavenly disciples that he's talking to, or is it, or apostles? I mean, that's a whole different discussion, apostles and disciples.
I mean, I think that he's talking directly to Paul. Like, I don't see any need for inserting anybody else there.
So on the night he was handed over, he was talking to Paul? Or do you because it says on the night when he was handed over, he took a loaf of bread, and this is before he died. This is like Jesus hasn't gone to his death in this chronology. You see what I'm trying to get at?
Right. I get that, but I mean, I think that there simply isn't any like indication as to who was around, who was there, or anything like that. So what it seems to me is like a visionary Jesus that is communicating to Paul that on the night I was handed over, these, and then the progression of things. So I think the you there, I think that if he's not talking to Paul like directly, as if I'm telling somebody a story or something like that, and I guess I'm inserting some kind of like first person's perspective to them or something. But even so, I think that this could definitely just be a reference to general Christians, like referencing to the general Christian congregation or whatever. I think that so maybe speaking directly to Paul isn't exactly correct. I think more likely Jesus is speaking to the general Christian population or the general Christian crowd, like the Christians as a group, rather than anybody that was around him or whatnot.
Right. Okay. So like my goal in this conversation is not to try and convince you of anything. You made it clear that like you don't find it like convincing, or even don't even understand why someone would be a historicist. And so my simple goal would at least to get you to go, I get why, even though I'm convinced mythicism makes more sense to me. Like that would be my goal in the conversation, is just to simply get you to see. You see what I'm trying to get at? Like,
well, I mean, I guess I understand. I guess on that particular aspect, I understand why people think that Jesus existed, but I guess when you're comparing like the two actual or like the best scholarly defense of these passages, and the best for mythicism, and then the best scholarly defense from historicity, when you compare those two, I can't see why people are convinced by the arguments. So like for instance on this one, I mean, I agree that it's ambiguous and we can't know exactly what Paul is talking about here. And so ultimately, I don't think that it works for either mythicism or historicism of Jesus. So this doesn't really factor into why I'm a mythicist or anything, because I think that it's too ambiguous.
If I might give you like my personal thoughts as to what I see here going on, even though I agree with you, this is ambiguous. Paul's very strange in his language here. This is going to get to Galatians. We're going to move into that, but let me just phrase the question this way. Who was Jesus speaking to in or from the lower heavens, right? On the night he was handed over before his death, resurrection, which I kind of already was asking. Was he communicating to Cephas through revelation prior to his resurrection, or was he having a celestial meal with celestial disciples? This is a question I ask because the mythicist model takes everything and puts it into the celestial when it comes to Christ. For me, it just seems a lot more like simpler. 1 Corinthians 15 is a post-resurrection creed. He's discussing what happened after the resurrection of Jesus. When I'm reading this, it sounds like here is Paul. And we're going to get into what I think the gospel in Galatians 1 and what he received and things like that. We're going to get into some of this discussion. I think that's important because too often these conversations end up in the gospels and they end up, and I'm talking about the 4 gospels, canonical gospels, or they end up in Josephus, or they end up in all these other places, when I think all we need to do is really dwell on Paul to get an understanding of why each other takes the position we do. On the night when he was handed over to me, this right here where he breaks bread, he has a communal meal with, I think these could be, I mean, this is a bit speculative, but I think these are the people who came before Paul, as mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15. It's not a leap to suggest that these are the people that he is then appearing to later on in 1 Corinthians 15. And so I do think that this fits minimal historicity, at least to some degree, if you look at it this way, even though who and where isn't described. I do think this makes a lot of sense, though, that there was a guy and he broke bread with them. And, then they had this apotheosis of this Christ character.
Well, so, I mean, that's what I mean by it's ambiguous, because I feel like it can work for both positions. I don't think that it works any less on mythicism than it does for historicism. I totally agree that this could be, a reference to a real actual meal where Jesus was having it with, other people or whatnot, whoever came before Paul. I could see that, but also under the understanding of a celestial Christ with, him, revealing this through a vision, and Jesus basically proclaiming this to the general Christian congregation. I think that works just as well as the historicist interpretation.
Yeah, and I think it's the heaven stuff that we're going to get into. Like, for me, it's like, if that was plainly spelled out, to me, it would make more sense. And I told this to Richard Carrier when we interviewed. One of the best interviews I ever did on mythicism was with Richard. And it's like, there's a lot of prior knowledge that Richard, admitted in the interview that you need to kind of assume in order for mythicism to make the most sense about the celestial Christ in heaven doing these things and such, because he's like, that's how strange the thinking was in these people, these Jews and their ideas back in those days. And for me, it's like, if the literature we have is all we've got and we're working with that and we're looking at it saying what's going on, if there was all that added, he was born or created, if you will, manufactured in heaven by the sperm of David, and he's in heaven being crucified, things like that. Those are the kind of things that I would need to see more of that heavenly stuff in order to assume that that's what's going on, other than just the ascension of Isaiah with Richard Carrier's position there. But if we could go on and Paul, go ahead and comment.
I mean, I get it that all of that seems like crazy and out there, but I mean, you're talking about a group of people that literally thought a column of fire led them around the desert for 40 years, force fed them these birds. They're not pigeons. I can't remember. Quail. Force fed them quail, created a sarlacc pit to swallow a bunch of them up. But he's defeated by iron. I mean, a lot of these things are just crazy and ridiculous, but they thought them. And so I don't think that it's really all that ridiculous to consider what the early Jews and Jewish Christians in the early first century probably believed. And I mean, maybe we can get into this when we start talking about more of a celestial Christ. But I mean, there are several references in both Paul's work as well as other Jewish texts that aren't included in the Bible, or maybe it's a Christian text that I'm thinking about. But in all of these books and stuff that people don't generally know about, they talk about this, these kinds of ideas. So, I mean, to me, I don't see crucifixions happening in the heavens and heaven being a physical place, especially when the Jews, the people of earth, according to the Bible, supposedly started to build a tower up to the heavens before God smited them and created all the different languages. It's very obvious that that the Jews thought that the heavens was a physical place that you could go to.
Right.
So I really don't think that all of that, like the crucifixions and deaths and burials and everything like that, that's really not as crazy as some people want to think about it.
Yeah, no, I think there's lots of crazy things. And I think we'll get into the celestial Christ. I think if you don't mind, I'll just keep going with the pericope, and then we definitely should, because I think those are interesting things as to what kind of like swayed me to think the way I do now. But Galatians 1, this is the hot spot. This is one of those fun spots, right? I have a video too, if you don't mind me sharing. I think it's going to be funny, like this little clip. And it's really, it is in the vein of this. So I'll just read the pericope, and then I'll have my question, and then we'll have whatever you'd like to do conversation-wise. For I want you to know, brothers, that the gospel that was proclaimed by me is not of human origin, for I did not receive it from a human source, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. You have heard, no doubt, of my earlier life in Judaism. I was violently persecuting the church of God and was trying to destroy it. I advanced in Judaism beyond many among my people of the same age, for I was far more zealous for the traditions of my ancestors. But when God had set me apart, sounding like a prophet, before I was born and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his son to me, there's some Greek that says in me, either way, so that I might proclaim him among the Gentiles. I did not confer right away with flesh and blood. Now we know, we'll get into this in detail here in a moment, but why do mythicists take Paul? This is a good question, I think. Take Paul's word, or take Paul at his word, that he did not receive any information about Jesus from any man, i.e. Christians he was persecuting. An analogy is this video that I really think is worth sharing, if you don't mind. It's funny too. You're going to get a crack out of this, I think. But here, if you don't mind sharing that. All right, here. This is really, really good too. Ready to laugh? Here we go.
That miracle.
Okay, 2009. Brian Simmons gets a new assignment. What happened?
Jesus Christ came into my room. He breathed on me, and he commissioned me.
When he breathed on you, I have to ask you this. What did it feel like?
It felt like a kiss from heaven. It felt like heaven's wind, the ruach, the breath, the wind of God that came upon me. And he spoke to me and said, I'm commissioning you to translate the Bible into the translation project that I'm giving you to do. And he promised that he would help me. And he promised me he would give me secrets of the Hebrew language.
Do you believe when he blew on you, there was an impartation for revelation?
I do. I believe the spirit of revelation was given. And I have to say, when he breathed on me, in no way would I want to compare that to the writers of the New Testament. The original.
So he's already backpedaling here because he sees a problem. Okay. And I'll bring up the pericope here, but I just wanted to make the analogy as we get into Brian Simmons. I don't know if you heard about this recently. He claims that he received the Passion Translation through divine revelation, but isn't it more likely that he simply is using existing translations? So when we look at his translation, we actually see a lot in common from already scholarly works in the Hebrew, scholarly works in his translation of the Bible, but he does a little here and a little there with his own thing. Is it not possible to interpret this? I mean, it's not even that it's possible to me. It's like Paul's gospel. What is it that he received? Is it anything about Jesus? Like if you talk about Jesus at all, that must be what is being equated here. Or is it the Gentile non-Torah message that he's bringing? And I think it's this non-Torah, you don't need to obey the Torah. It's this new covenant type message that is not Judaizing. I don't think he's saying he didn't learn about Jesus from other people. That's where I come in, but I'd love to get your thoughts.
Well, I mean, the gospel that was proclaimed by me, I mean, in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, he lays out what the gospel is. The gospel being the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, and then what that what that resurrection means, for people. And I mean, he plainly lays out in his writings, like when he's talking about, the things that Jesus told him through the visions and through scriptures. And then, so, I mean, when we're talking about the gospel, we're talking about like, the death, burial, and resurrection, and the theological things that kind of surround that.
Anything about Jesus, are you factoring that in? Anything? Because this guy's persecuting a Christian church by his own words. He's already acquainted with things they're saying, with the message they must have had. So he must know something prior to his revelation about Jesus.
Well, and I mean, I do think that he definitely he probably got some things from earlier Christians, but the point is that he couldn't say that, right? Like he couldn't say that, oh, I got this from, Christians before me, because then that invalidates his apostleship.
I agree, but is it worth believing what he's saying here, or is it kind of like maybe Brian Simmons, where he's a bullshit artist in a way, and he might be a weird, nutty kind of guy who actually believes he had this vision or whatever, but at the same time, should we believe that Paul did not learn anything from other apostles or other people that were out there about Jesus, especially if he admits in 1 Corinthians, like, for example, Cephas is earlier and things like that?
This seems extremely speculative at this point, because you're speculating what information that Paul heard. All I'm saying is that we don't know what information that Paul heard, but what we do know is that the only things that Paul is relaying to us were confirmed to him via visions and the scriptures. So regardless of where his ultimate source comes from, the Paul is only relaying information that has been confirmed by those two sources that grant him this apostleship, being visions and scriptures. And so, I mean, that's what Paul is saying, is that, this information doesn't come from... And you believe
Paul, though, on that. That's the thing I'm saying, is like, it's like saying Brian Simmons really only learned this from revelation. Like, he didn't have any other sources. I'm a naturalist. I'm looking at Paul thinking, where did he get this insight? I doubt he's reading only the Septuagint and having these visions. I imagine he knows something about Christianity, especially since he's fighting against it before he converted.
Right. So, I mean, there's a big difference between the analogy that you brought up and reading Paul. Imagine that, we're 2,000 years into the future, right? And we got this Passion Translation, and we've got this, this vague accounting of the guy who says that Jesus, gave him this in a vision. I mean, if we had the background knowledge of like, well, all of these people were having these visions, which, I mean, I guess technically we do nowadays, even though we don't take them seriously. If you transport it back to the first century CE, I mean, people didn't think that if you got a vision from a god or a celestial vision or whatever, like from these celestial beings, that you were, crazy immediately. Like, sure, they probably thought some people were crazy, but I mean, there were a lot more people that were taken seriously, by the population back then than they do now. But I mean, if you transport us 2,000 years in the future, and the people 2,000 years in the future saw us as these, like, idiot people who believed in all these crazy non-reality things, then I mean, I think that it would be hard. We would be in the same position. It'd be hard to prove that this guy just was copying from other translations, or was getting it from whoever or wherever. I think that Paul having these kinds of hallucinations, and then reading from scripture, which he admits right here in this particular passage, that he's advanced in his Judaism beyond many among his people of the same age. So I mean, he's saying that he knows the scriptures. He knows it better than just about anybody else, or as good as, no, actually, better than everybody his age. And so I think that he's getting a lot of this from scripture.
I agree.
but he's also confirming information, given to him through scriptures. He's probably, or not scriptures, sorry, visions.
Right.
I think that the visions are probably adding some information to it. But the major point here that I want to make is that we don't know what information could have been floating around prior to Paul. Mm-hmm. All we know is what information about this Christ character was confirmed by the scriptures and by Paul's visions. And considering that the gospel or the information that was being preached by Paul matches the same information that Cephas and the other apostles were teaching, it seems to me like they were all getting it from the same place, which would be scriptures. And I think probably the scriptures were informing like the visions that they were having. Like I definitely think that there was some kind of like real place that the visions were manifesting from, like, their psyche was pulling this information out of. And I mean, I really think that a lot of it comes from an understanding of the scriptures, with Paul being a very educated person, knowing how to write in Greek and everything like that, and knowing about the other religions in the surrounding area. I think that his brain, put all that shit together.
I agree.
And confirmed maybe some of the things that he was hearing, but the important point is that we don't know what he heard prior to it, and I think that it's at least for me, it's kind of bad form to speculate that he got this information from human sourcing. And if we just assume that he was lying about this or anything, then I kind of make that. I think that makes
he says, "I do not lie," like 11 times in his letter. Like it's he over and over is trying to deny his lying. And to me, man, I don't think it's that much speculative, and I don't think it's a ridiculous claim, because right after this, he goes to visit them and he's meeting with them. And of course, he wants to make his message different from them. He talks against them, those super apostles. He doesn't like them. He uses them to bolster his apostleship. But Paul talks against the other 12, the super apostles. He's not pro these guys. He's anti these guys, but he has to kind of use their clout to get his message out there. And so he is the chief apostle in all of it.
So if that's the case, why is it that when he comes back to Jerusalem in Galatians 2, he says that he corroborated his gospel with the other apostles' gospels, mm-hmm. and they had nothing to add to his?
Right. They gave him the approval. And then James sent spies to check out Paul and make sure Paul was doing the right thing. There were spies that were sent to see his gospel, to see what he was doing. And it's like he's pissed that they agreed, but then turned around and are sending people to check up on him and see what's going on.
I don't really think any of that matters. I think what matters here is the fact that the information that he is teaching or preaching, rather, is the same information that the other apostles.
We don't know that it is, though, because he's paying the poor. I mean, there's money involved in this whole thing. So when I wouldn't buy what Paul's saying, hook, line, and sinker is all I'm saying. So if you take Paul, his gospel is only directly from a Septuagint, whatever scriptures he has, because there's no canonical full Hebrew Bible in Greek that he's aware of. He has certain literature he's reading from the Septuagint, and his visions. I don't see it as ridiculous to say there were previous people who were Christians who he was persecuting, this community, a small community of believing people that believed in this Jesus or this Christ or whatever, and that he's picking up information from them as well. The same reason that Brian Simmons has a special revelation as he's translated in the Bible, and he's claiming it's this direct revelation. Jesus breathed on him and all this stuff and has given him the words and all that. But there's so many different things that he's picking up from. I don't believe that Paul didn't learn something of Christianity and the Christians. And I mean, for me, we're going to get to the heavenly stuff, but I think that like that, to me, I wouldn't take that so far as to say the only source he had, the only thing he does is what Paul's saying. I didn't get this from any humans at all, which would mean everything he has to say about Jesus, he's trying to say, I got none of this from human source. Mm-hmm. I don't believe that's the case. I think his gospel is something specific and that it is unique and different. It's a message that's being presented to Gentiles.
I get wanting to go direction. But as I said before, we don't know what that information is. All we have to go off of is Paul's works, right? So we don't know what information he could have possibly gotten from people. We don't know what information he ignored from people. What we don't, these are things that we don't know. But also, I want to point out that even let's just go ahead with your position and assume that Paul lifted his stuff from previous Christians and is passing it off as like visions from Jesus. That still only gets us back to beliefs. Like
I don't think he's passing it off as visions. I think he's changed.
Well, I mean, I was just so sorry. I mean, I was just trying to go like an extreme, like, you know, an extreme hypothesis or case for it. I didn't mean to represent it as like that's your position.
Okay. I'm just trying to.
I know. I didn't mean to represent it as like that's your position. I'm just saying like let's go like the full nine. Like Paul definitely like he didn't have visions. He's lying to us about all this, and he's really you know piecing things together from previous Christians. Even if that were the case, that still only gets us back to these are the beliefs of the first Christians. And there's you would need more information in order to connect those beliefs to a historical person.
Yeah, and that's where like we have 7 letters. We know he wrote more. We don't have anything extra. These are letters specifically to churches where he's mostly rebuking a lot of them or giving them a pat on the back. There's not a lot of data. And I know how mythicists view this like lack of historical criteria of Jesus. Why isn't he mentioning he's from Galilee? Why isn't he doing this and that? Only the Gospels do, which we're not getting into the Gospels today. I just think it's important to focus on Paul. So I get that there's not all this other information in Paul. And I feel like the mythicist gospel, so to speak, is Paul. Like you got to stick to Paul or mythicists don't give a shit about what you have to say because it hinges on Paul mainly. Everything comes down to Paul. And if you see Paul through the lens, I'm trying to say, here's an earlier community. He may have even had this tradition that on the night he was you know, handed over and he broke bread or whatever. Paul puts this whole, what looks like a mystery cult type teaching in this, that Jesus is saying, do this in remembrance of me until he comes. This may have been something that was already created by the Cephas and other people beforehand, but was passed on to Paul. Like I'm starting with this assumption that, okay, when we read that, without being too speculative, Facebook still makes noise even when I have like everything supposed to run through my ears. I'm starting with that community and saying like, okay, like this whole notion of outer space, that all of this stuff is happening in outer space. While I get it, people believe in weird stuff. In the text, I'm not seeing that all over the place. And when I look around for crucifixions, for births, for things like that, I see like, sure, I see stars bringing, births to earth, not in the third heaven. I see crucifixions, Josephus, Philo. I see it all over the place on earth. And I see this stuff over and over. Like, to me, it just seemed a lot more ad hoc and not ridiculous to say this happened here on earth rather than presenting it only in heaven. You know what I mean?
Well, I get that. But we're taking a lot on Paul. I mean, are we just disregarding Hebrews like altogether? Hebrews doesn't factor in at all.
No, we could definitely go to Hebrews if you want. I mean, I didn't bring up the pericope because obviously Paul didn't write Hebrews, and I'm not so sure if that's an early or late book. Sorry. Hebrews is written right around the same time as Paul was writing, but it was not written by Paul. We're not certain.
Is my understanding.
Yeah, we're not certain, but it's not a bad guess. Like Harold Attridge wrote the Hermeneia commentary on Hebrews, and I interviewed him on this, and he said, I'm not so sure it's early. It seems like they've already kind of done what we call replacement theology, and they're using terminology that it was only for Jews, and now they're giving all of that terminology to Christians. It's almost like the church has taken Israel's identity in this letter. So I'm not sure. I know Richard Carrier thinks it's written in the 60s before the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, but the Hermeneia commentary and others, they're saying it might be later. That's why I didn't bring it in, because, scholars can't even unanimously agree on this. And the main people who wrote the Hermeneia commentary on it, he came to a conclusion it was later, or at least somewhat later, but we can't put a date on that. He thinks it's post 70 though.
I've got some King James version verses to bring up whenever we start talking about like the celestial stuff. And I hate that. I hate interrupting your.
No, dude. This is a conversation, dude. If it was like a debate, it'd be like, something here that just for me, I thought I would be interested in bringing up is in the same way we also, when we were children, to the elements of the world, we were enslaved. And I think this is when you're talking to whether Jew or Greek, Gentile or not, the idea that they had to like perform all these rituals and sacrifices, even in the cultic systems that pagans had to practice, I think he's addressing both worlds, Jewish and Greek.
Yeah, I'm so glad you're bringing this up, because this is another one of those things where I just literally I don't understand the historicist argument for this particular stuff right here.
Okay, yeah, for me, it sounds pretty simple to me. To the elements of the world, this is talking about the systems, the religious systems of the world. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, put under the law, in order to redeem those under the law, in order that we might receive adoption and become, because you are sons, God sent the spirit of his son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father, so that you are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir through God. Now, born of a woman, put under the law in order to redeem those under the law. Like, to me, I understand the born term. I get it. Genomos, I think it is. We can look at that and say, well, this could be manufactured. I understand that Richard Carrier has taken the position that this is manufactured because there are places. By the way, that's a very common Greek word that it's not like it only has this inclination to being manufactured, or there are better terms to just explicitly say birthed.
But, well, no. So the actual argument here is not that there are better terms or more explicit terms. It's actually in the way that Paul uses the terms specifically. Mm-hmm. I might be preaching to the choir.
Why would he even say he was born of a woman? Like, come on, like, is that
no? That's not the point. Every other place that Paul talks about somebody being physically born, like on earth, he uses a different word. Mm-hmm. When he's talking about Jesus's birth, he uses this word. So when he's talking about other people being born, he uses genao, which is more explicitly talking about birth. And then when he's talking about Jesus specifically, he uses genomai. So
not just Jesus, though. There's a lot of places he uses genomai. And it's not just that, like the idea of Timothy. I think it's in 1 Timothy. I don't have those pericope. I should have brought
referring to birth, though? Like he refers to other people
he uses
being made?
Oh, no. This same exact term here in Galatians 4, he uses that elsewhere. And it's not talking about birth, like born literally like a woman actually giving birth. That would be the most common you would imagine that Paul means by that term. But he uses this genomai in such a strange, common way that it is kind of a vague term. It's almost like talking about in Matthew, where we know in the Greek it says virgin, right? And we're like, okay, we know that's virgin. But in the Hebrew Bible, it could just mean young woman. But a young woman could be a virgin, but there are better words to directly say what a virgin is. And it doesn't use that term. So it's not like a thing I would die on the hill there and go, oh my gosh. But if he wasn't born of a woman and manufactured of a woman, put under the law, I just don't see heaven in all of this. You see what I'm saying? So whatever the interpretation is here, I don't see him saying, oh, this happened up here in heaven. It just seems people have birth. They, birth people here on earth that could, you know what I mean?
No, I mean, specifically, I take it that you reject the idea that this is part of a larger allegory, right?
I know Richard Carrier takes this position of Hagar and Sarah, and he goes into the allegorical back and forth. I don't reject it. None of this is rejected by me, John. I'm picking information and I'm trying to kind of sift through it and think about it. So I'm not closed off. But I think this is relying on this idea that he believes Jesus was just like the other children of Israel. He was actually a born Jew who had to follow the commandments and was under the law, put under the law for those who were also under the law. And to me, I don't see any problem with that, especially when you could take figures, just an example of another actual existing human being that had similar weird things done to him. Julius Caesar Augustus. This guy we know existed without a doubt, was a strange high priest-like figure. In fact, he might have even been a priest of Israel or Jerusalem at the time, because he's like ruling over the people. But in Suetonius, Lives of the Caesars, he has this wild birth narrative where he's conceived and all this stuff, completely mythological material. And yet he's like a savior. He brings peace. This guy like has a cult. The imperial cult is around this guy. And we know he existed. All I'm saying is like, it's not ridiculous to think this guy was born of a woman and put under the law like anyone else that was a Jew.
Right.
That's all I'm saying. And I'm not saying it dogmatically. That's how it appears to me. And I wanted to bring that up because really, here's another one, right? Formerly, when you did not know God, you were enslaved to those, but that by nature are not gods. But now he's talking about idols, obviously. These are just the pagan gods. But now that you have come to know God, or rather be known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and worthless elements of the world? And I think these are the religious systems that they're observing, like all the stuff that Paul's message is not pro. Whose slaves you want to be once more. You observe days and months and seasons and years. I am afraid I may have labored over you in vain. Just that is how I'm seeing the elements of this world in this particular, as they're observing these sacred rites to keep their sins forgiven. And whether it be a mystery cult that's pagan or Christianity or Jewish, doesn't matter. They think they need this stuff to be saved. And he's thinking, no, you need this Christ thing, this new thing, my gospel.
Well, right. But I mean, as far as this being part of a larger allegory, I feel like that means that he's talking about Jesus's, body, how it was constructed. But I don't think that he's necessarily like the fact that it was a celestial body or whatnot isn't being pointed out here. Like the importance of this part is to explain how Jesus's sacrifice of death, burial, and resurrection cleanses you of your sin, and by Jesus being made in this body of flesh, whether celestial or not, he's under the law. Like
if it's not celestial, though, would it work for mythicism? Though, I mean, that's what I'm trying to get at. Like, if it's not a celestial body, could it work for mythicism? I don't see how it would.
No, I mean, if any of these arguments are about a physical body here on Earth, it doesn't work for mythicism. So I guess I don't understand that distinction.
That was one of the issues I was having. I was like, okay, I'm trying to paint an analogy here, because Paul seems to be trying to paint analogies. Like Christ did all that humans. He like became the new Adam, the last Adam, if you will, of it. It just, to me, well, right. He has no analogy. If he's just a celestial being who's not really a human, a mortal human who came down and had to observe the same things that other Jews had to do and things like that. I just think that the analogy makes better sense since this is on earth rather than in heaven.
I don't see how it makes more sense. Given that the mythicist point of view is that Jesus's body was constructed by God, in order to be a flesh and blood body in the celestial realm, and for that body to die and then him resurrect, shedding that sin and going back up into heaven. I guess I don't see the big shift between celestial. Here's how I'm thinking about it: is that the early Jews in the early first century, as well as Christians, considered the celestial realm to be a physical place, just like they considered hell or Sheol or whatever to be a physical place. So I guess I'm not understanding exactly why it's a big shift for some people. Like, I don't understand why it being in the celestial realm versus on the face of the earth. Like, they're both physical places. They're at least that's how Paul especially sees the celestial realm as a physical place that you go to. So, I mean, it seems to me like there's not a big shift in thinking there. It's just, oh, it happened there.
Yeah, for me, it's two things. So it's not this clear, explicit statement of being in heaven. And if you're a human whose everyday life is here on earth, and you're making like statements like, oh, and Bobby was born, we don't jump to in heaven unless the text says so. I don't see any reason to jump to the ad hoc presupposition that it starts in heaven, unless the literature is constantly letting us know, oh, by the way, put under the law in heaven, manufactured in heaven. This stuff's taking place up there rather than here. You see what I'm saying?
Well, I mean, that's a little bit, I feel like that's a little bit of a straw man analogy there of the description, because like in modern, like if they were to have this conversation now without all the ambiguity of their vocabulary, I think that if you said, oh yeah, Tommy was born in 1996, that would I feel like most people would, take that to be, oh yeah, he was like born, like physically birthed, in that year. But what I feel like Paul is saying here is that, like if he was having it in modern day, it's like, oh yeah, he was created back in 1996. And I feel like everybody would be like, the fuck are you talking about created? Was he a test tube, like fake, those fake wombs or whatnot? Like is he was created that way? Like was he copied or cloned or whatever? Like I feel
ginomai that has you hung up.
Well, I mean, yeah. Especially given that every time Paul refers to physical births, it's genao, which is more explicitly indicates birth. And with him choosing to use genomai, when we know that he knows genao and he's used genao, I feel like the use of genomai is very deliberate, and to say that also means physical birth it doesn't make sense to me why he changes up the words,
Yeah, I think, well, that's the thing. Genomai can mean born. Even if you would say, well, he didn't use that term there, I just don't think that means like, oh, in heaven. Even if it said created, like now we have to go created in heaven. I mean, we have to take it up there, because what if the act of a virgin birth, let's say, was simply saying, look, they had this belief Jesus had a noble birth and he's created by God with Mary. I mean,
but Paul never says virgin birth.
I know. I'm making an analogy, because you were using an analogy to point out, like, he doesn't say birth in the same term your hope, like you wish he used the other term to make his explicit point. But I'm saying that how you talked about lack of information and speculation and stuff earlier about in Galatians. I feel like that whole heavenly presupposition of assuming Paul thinks heaven in all these cases, where he doesn't imagine Jesus actually took on flesh on earth, but rather was in heaven doing all this stuff. I think that's an assumption that requires more evidence in order for me, like, to be convinced of it anymore. I'm like, hold on. Every time I interviewed Robert Price and other people and said, what is this crucifixion? What happened? I'm looking at Josephus. I'm looking at Philo. I'm reading about actual crucifixions that Jews are really going through by the Romans. And I'm thinking, is this the gospel? The Gospel of Mark, like, playing an impact on my understanding here, and like really Paul has the correct understanding and it's all heavenly, but then something happened between Paul and Mark where Mark made up all this BS, but Paul actually had the true heavenly understanding of a crucifixion and stuff. You see what I'm trying to get at?
Well, I mean, I guess I do, but at the same time, I feel like what's your answer for why Paul changes up words?
That's a great question. I don't know why a lot of people use words certain ways that they do. And getting into his mind, I do have So here's a screen share image that I have. If I could share it, I just popped it up. This one right here actually gives you that term you're talking about that he uses to become, right? Or be made, figuratively be born. And in this, I don't know if our audience can see it. I hope they can. But like, here are the examples, right? Were made from the seed of David according to the flesh. Galatians 4:4, made, born from a woman, made, born under the law. Philippians 2:7, made in the likeness of men. Galatians 21:3, of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him. And
well, so I'm only I'm only concerned with how Paul uses the word. Not
I'm just pointing out
Genesis.
Well, he did read the Septuagint. He did read the Septuagint, and maybe he's lifting these words from his Greek Septuagint, which is what I'm reading right here.
But I feel like he would, while he may read it from the Septuagint, I still feel like he would write it as if he would use it.
Well, that's what you just said earlier in Galatians. You said you think that he only used the scripture and revelation or his visions.
For information, not for like the words that he's writing on the page. Like I feel like he got his information from the scriptures, but I don't think that he was copying verbatim like from the scriptures into his work. Like the scriptures informed him. Like and I mean how like the Septuagint version of Genesis or Josephus's Antiquities, Plato's Republic. I don't think that those have a lot of bearing on how Paul uses the words. I feel like if we're going to analyze what Paul means, we need to analyze how Paul uses the words.
We only have 7 letters too, though. This is another problem is we're dealing with a limited corpus of Pauline literature, and we're going to assume that this word ginomai, has to mean this particular thing in our mythicist model. If it doesn't mean that, then minimal historicism makes most sense in terms of being able to factor in the data. But here, I just wanted to show like Paul uses that term in 1 Corinthians 15:37. You do not sow the body, which is to be the ginomai, or 1 Corinthians 15. The first man, Adam, became a living soul from earth, right? And man became a living soul. Manufactured, you would say, created, right? In this particular thing. And I think, I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, Paul specifically has the idea or the concept that Jesus's body was just the same as Adam's body, and how our future resurrection bodies are, which are bodies that are manufactured by God.
Wouldn't Paul think that about his resurrected body? He's the first fruits of the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15.
Right. But I mean, Paul says that, Jesus's body is the same as Adam's body and as our future resurrection bodies.
I don't know. This is speculation, but I kind of want to know, like, do you think that Paul thinks Adam is a celestial figure and he didn't come to earth?
I mean, that's actually one of the images that I've got. I don't know if you want me to.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, I was just.
Well, I know that you
examples and stuff. That's all.
No, that's fine. I mean, but the thing that I have is very specifically on this point about what Paul thought about Adam's body. Hold on, sorry, my I'm scatterbrained right now.
Dude, you're fine, bro. Don't worry about it.
Okay. Let's see. Share screen window. This guy. Okay. So 2 Corinthians 12 or 2 Corinthians 12, 2-4. I knew a man in Christ above 14 years ago, whether in the body I cannot tell, whether out of the body I cannot tell, God knoweth, such as one caught up to the third heaven. And I knew such a man, whether in body or out of body I cannot tell, God knoweth, how that he was caught up into paradise and heard unspeakable words, which is not lawful for a man to utter. Mm-hmm. So this is Paul acknowledging that the paradise or the Garden of Eden is actually in the third heaven. Mm-hmm. Do we agree with that or no?
Yeah, I'm open to that. I don't see any reason not to think that's probably something right. that Paul believes, especially by the time Paul's in the first century, Hellenistic Jew with a mystery religion or mystery cult within Judaism, in some form of Judaism, that he thinks that paradise, this Eden where Adam was kicked out of, is up in heaven. But he also is now brought to earth. I mean, here he is working the ground, and Eve is the mother of all living. She is kind of a direct descendant through the genealogy, according to these Jews, to David, and then David to Jesus. You know what I mean?
Well, right. I get that they're kicked out of heaven down to earth because that's the slums, I guess. But this is I feel like this is evidence that, you know, God does create physical human bodies in the heavens.
I don't know. You know, I don't know. That's why I'm like too dogmatic on this, but it could.
Well,
it could be.
mean, do you think that Paul believed that God like manufactured Adam's body out of dirt?
I would think he definitely created Adam from dirt. Yeah, from the earth. Or at least that's what I'm thinking. Like, it sounds, well, see, that's the problem. I wrestle between going back to Genesis, and that's a big no-no, between trying to understand what a first century Jew would have thought about Genesis. That's a difficult thing to kind of parse for me, right? Because there's so many ideas floating around. Jews don't even agree with other Jews on these ideas, but let's roll with that interpretation and just say Paul believes that paradise is Eden here, and that Eden is where God made Adam.
Okay. Well, I mean, what else could paradise mean here other than Eden?
That's a great question. I mean, I don't know. I'm not really certain of that. I would ask other people who probably are aware of literature surrounding this if this means Eden. Not really sure.
Okay. But I mean, don't you think that it would be a little weird for Jews not to consider Adam to be created by God from earthly material? And
I think it'd be weird? What?
Don't you think it would be weird if Jews in the first century CE did not consider Adam to be a person that was created or molded or made into flesh by God?
I think it would be weird to think that a Jew would not think that Adam was not created from dust or dirt of the earth. And it sounds like earth. The question I have is, when we get back to that paradise question, is like, did God relocate paradise? Did he move paradise? Is this something that was always in the third heaven? Is Paul imagining Adam was created in the third heaven and then sent down to earth? Or does Paul believe Adam is a celestial being the entire time and he goofed it up? And then how did the human race come from Adam in outer space? There's some disconnects in my mind.
Well, so how do you feel about the revelation of Moses?
I don't know if I've read the revelation of Moses. Well, you mean like in the Hebrew Bible, or are you talking about like?
No, this is
other literature.
This is other literature outside of it, because in the revelation of Moses, or it often is called the Apocalypse of Moses, I believe, or maybe it's the life of Adam and Eve. Maybe.
Okay. I've heard of it, and I haven't read it yet.
Okay. Well, the revelation of Moses 37:4-5. And 41-2, both has that Adam's body was buried in the third heaven.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean,
that's weird. That is very weird to know that he's in the third heaven. I have a lot of questions. I'd like to read that and check it out for myself and see what other academics on that particular literature have to say about the time and what is being meant here. What's the idea? Because Josephus, whereas the Hebrew Bible says that Moses died and didn't enter into the promised land, Josephus says Moses didn't die. Josephus in Antiquities actually says that Moses ascended and had an apotheosis, just like Elijah and just like Enoch. So like, he doesn't think Moses died, but he ascended on high. And it's just kind of weird. Here he is being buried in the third heaven. I need to look at that.
Okay. And then as far as like the celestial stuff goes, Hold on if I can. No, wrong. There we go. Hebrews 9:22 through 24, which I had mentioned earlier. So it says, and almost all things are by the law purged with blood, and without shedding of blood is no remission. It was therefore necessary that the patterns of things in the heavens should be purified with these, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ has not entered into the holy places made with hands, which are the figures of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. So this is saying that there are copies of things in the heavens as they exist on earth.
Jesus' prayer, on earth as it is in heaven, according to one of the Gospels, which is a Jewish prayer, not necessarily a Christian one. But if you parse that out, you'll look and go, that's pretty Jewish. But yeah, I have no issues with that. I also I'm not jumping from that though and then thinking, well, there wasn't a guy that actually got crucified, and they've made much to do with it. See, for me, I don't see him being crucified in heaven, even if one wants to reflect, well, guess what? What's on earth is in heaven. Okay, then both are true. Here you have a man who actually dies on earth and is really crucified, and yet there's a heavenly copy that's also being crucified. Mythicism and historicism are true at the same time. I mean, we could do the copies thing and make it like, well, he died on earth, and it's like that archons argument. The archons of this age, they came after him if they knew what they were doing. I mean, is this to say that human agents aren't controlled by the spirits, the demona, the demons, or if you will, the powers of the air, et cetera, et cetera? There's just a lot of questions to have. I don't know if that makes sense, but just lots of questions.
Well, I mean, I feel like the archons of this aeon is a pretty telling phrase. I mean, I think that the archons of this aeon could mean that, it's talking about like Roman rulers or whatnot. It'd be a weird way to reference them, I think.
Is it possible that they think that the archons, Paul thinks the archons are these spiritual powers that control these agents, is my point.
So let me ask you this. Who does Paul consider to be the ruler of the earth?
You talking about in pseudo Pauline literature in Ephesians equates this idea that the devil or Satan, the prince of the air, etc. So here you have demonic powers, he thinks, that are in this sphere of the earth, right? The air that we are breathing he's in control of this area. That's what I think.
Well, right. But Paul directly says in a similar fashion to archons of this aeon that the rulers of this, of the earth, or the ruler of this earth is Satan. And we also know that other people at that time referred to Satan and his demons as archons of this aeon. So, well, I mean, ultimately, I think
if we found I just want to jab in there because I think it's necessary. Like, if we leave on the note of like only, we found this passage that says archons of this aeon are demonic. If we find that phrase archons of this aeon used in literature as well, that shows that they mean human ruler powers, whatever type of thing. Like, it's like a toss-up, flip a coin kind of thing. Which one are you going with? And that's why I like Elaine Pagel's book on the origins of Satan, where she's saying the whole demonic forces that keep going on between groups, whether it be Paul and Apollos and Paul's gospel versus other gospels, or even early church Christianity against other Christians or Gnostics or whatever, like they demonize each other. They literally say, "Oh, you're ruled by the power of Satan," or the Satan has deceived you. And it's like, well, hold on. These are people who are deceiving people, but we're saying Satan deceived them. So it's like, it's a both and thing. And I think that the archons of this age could simply mean the powers that they believe are spiritually behind these human agents doing things are demonic, or whatever you want to call it, spirits.
Don't you? I mean, isn't that pretty speculative in that you've got to insert a good portion of that? Like with my argument that archons of this aeon means the Satan and his demons being the archons of this aeon. I mean, we've got Paul that references Satan in a similar way later on in his writing. We've got we know at this point in time that was a popular title that was used for Satan and his demons, considering that we don't have a lot to go off of, as far as references in Paul on this phrase. I mean, seeing how that phrase is generally used in the first century, I think can give us some kind of insight into it. I'm not really, in order to make my case, I don't have to presume, these are the spirits that are influencing the humans. Like, I mean, whenever a spirit is maliciously influencing humans or influencing somebody, it kind of seems like, at least in the Bible, I can't think of specific times in Paul, but from what I've seen in the Bible, it specifically says, this person's affected by demons. Mm-hmm. And I feel like in order for me to believe that particular hypothesis that it was, these evil spirits are affecting the Romans, I think that I would need to see something similar to that from Paul.
Yeah,
like
that's
the archons of this aeon are controlling the Romans or influencing the Romans. Like I feel like speculating about, inserting a whole other thing in there, I feel is a little not warranted exactly, considering all of the other evidence.
I don't want us to get into the Gospels at all. Like, I really want to save that conversation for another day if we ever want to. But I mean, if we're using evidence in the New Testament, it wasn't just Paul, which I grant you, like in Paul, it's ambiguous, but it also doesn't mean it isn't the powers that are behind, because in the Gospels, Satan enters Judas and Judas performs the deed. Oh, okay. Well, I mean, Satan controls Judas in his act. And of course, he's predetermined, according to one of the Gospels, to do this. So like, I could use the Gospels, but the Gospels aren't the greatest when you're dealing with mythicism, because mythicists also have like that kind of, hey, we need to deal with Paul. Paul's our guy. We need to really get into. So I wanted to focus on that, and just to point out, like, in Paul, I'll grant you, like, I think that this is talking about demons. I'm not in disagreement with you at all on that. I'm simply saying demons control people, and people get demonized, and people are cursed for preaching other gospels. And probably Paul's thinking they're probably possessed or probably have these crazy ideas that are controlled by the enemy. I'm not going to the bank on that. I'm simply saying I definitely see him condemning others that teach different teachings. And I imagine they're not teachings of God, because he talks about the elements of this world. And he thinks that these are like fake gods and stuff like that, and that they're the ones that are going to be defeated in the end. He's given these pagans like, hey, my God's going to defeat all these false deities that you worship and stuff that are like a thorn in Paul's side. So Paul thinks that spirits and demons are actually messing with him. I did want to show one more, like, sorry. We should have been flipping back and forth this whole time for visual sake, but
Yeah. I'm so sorry. I was about to ask you if you wanted to talk about anything else, because I know we've been kind of.
I know, dude. I have fun talking with you, though. This is good.
Yeah.
In what sense was Jesus put under the law in the lower heavens? Was he subject to the requirements of Torah in the lower heavens in the same way that Jews were on earth? Was a celestial Jesus circumcised and subject to dietary restrictions in the lower heavens? I think at this point you've already kind of answered, saying that there's a replication of copies, and to you, you would think, no problem. You think Paul would say all this stuff's happening in heaven. Am I wrong?
Well, I mean, I when Paul is talking about this, the allegory there with being born of a woman, I think he's just talking about Jesus being made of like human flesh, of I guess technically Davidic flesh. I think that's what he's talking about, because David was under Torah law. He's trying to create this sort of imagery of this body that was created from this Davidic flesh body that was created by God. So it was quote unquote under the law. Mm-hmm. And then when that body dies and then resurrects, that body is now like sinless. It's clean, as it were, so that that body can enter heaven.
Okay. So this is an explanatory scope image here, and just to kind of show, I found this a while back, and I was like, this is really interesting. The references to Jesus, begotten of a woman, begotten under the law, Galatians 4:4, like we just talked about. And
Camille Greger gave me this a while back.
it's been around for a while. And I think that at the end of the day, like, you could still have your interpretation for minimal mythicism in these pericope, and minimal historicity would still be possible or true.
Well, so I do think that minimal historicity is possible, and I pretty much stick with Carrier on the 1 in 3 chance that Jesus could be historical, and any one of these verses in Paul could definitely be referencing like a historical person. My position on them is that they're too ambiguous, and it doesn't help either position. But I find the minimal mythicist stuff to better explain it. And I mean, like, I don't know why, like, for every single one of these where minimal mythicism fails, it's literally the interpretation that it can only confirm minimal historicity.
So that you're saying there might be other interpretations other than the ones listed here, for example, in those pericope. Is that what you're suggesting?
No, I mean, what I'm suggesting here is that, like, for instance, the very first one, begotten of a woman, begotten under the law, Galatians 4:4, literally born from Mary. Like, that's right. Inserting a lot of information into it. It also ignores like information surrounding the word he used, genomai.
So that's also factoring in, I think, the idea that you're having the Gospels. So we are inserting gospel material. This is not just in Paul and this. Well, I would say it's that idea. For example, this is a problem I think that mythicists have in this respect, is we're limiting only the material for Paul. Paul's like our only literature that we're actually gleaning to figure out about Jesus. When Paul's only 7 letters, he's not talking about people, places, geography. This is a guy that was persecuting a Christian movement or a following Jesus movement, who then turns into one and then isn't even really a friend, and he's actually communicating against these super apostles, these other apostles who initially were part of this movement before him. And here he is communicating against these guys. I have a hard time thinking that in all these letters, Paul is going to give you that information. So, like,
go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just saying, like, when you factor in that other material being written about Jesus here early on is saying things about him, even if it is highly mythological, like the Gospels are, I don't see any reason not to look at that. Just like I look at Caesar Augustus and Lives of the Caesars from Suetonius. Highly mythological, from his birth to the miracles he performs in his life and all that. And I'm thinking to myself, but we know this guy existed. We have obviously great information. Like Jesus, we have none of that. Like, I wish we did if we were going to get this answer. At the end of the day, you could be right, I could be wrong. At the end of the day, I could be right, you could be wrong. None of us is like dying on a hill here on this data. I'm just saying, if we factor in the Gospels in some respect, which gets into a different conversation, then you have the earliest Gospel, Mark, indicate things like not the birth narrative, right? This is Matthew, but definitely stuff like Jesus has a brother and he has a mother named Mary, which is implying she birthed him, even if you don't agree. Even if you don't agree with much of the Gospels being historically reliable. You know what I mean?
I mean, I get
it's an early account.
But there's no indication from Paul that he knows that
Paul doesn't care about it.
Existed.
Paul doesn't care about it. Neither did Luke. Luke's gospel actually downplays the siblings and the mother of Jesus. Doesn't even care about them. So it's like, maybe Paul doesn't care about them. Maybe Paul cares about his gospel, and he's a nutcase who's having these visionary experiences running around trying to teach these Gentiles a mystery cult version of this Jesus movement. I mean,
maybe we can cover the gospel, because I mean, I feel like this is getting into how do you discern fact from fiction in the Gospels, and I feel like that could be a perfect live stream for us to have.
I definitely can't answer that question. I'm not an expert in being able to like figure that kind of, no expert in anything. I don't think it's possible to really be dogmatic or definitive about much of that. But I would say what I'm trying to get at is we can throw it all out and say none of it counts, or say whoever wrote this has a witness here, even if it is after 70 AD, Gospel Mark, is suggesting that he had siblings, even if you want to argue hey, these are highly mythological texts where he's walking on water and this and that. Now, if you say because they're highly mythological and they state all this crazy stuff and we have other literature, and I agree that there's lots of literature out there with miracles and all this nonsense that's added about figures and whatnot. Therefore, we can't trust that this guy had siblings. Someone's writing that he had siblings or that he had a mother or whatever. I mean, I guess that's your call, but I don't think it's ridiculous to think the guy was a guy. I think the teacher of righteousness in the Dead Sea Scrolls was a guy.
I don't want you to think that I think historicists are ridiculous. I never meant to communicate that at all.
That was what I thought you said up front. I'm like, okay, please don't think I'm like ridiculous. John, please, man, please.
No. I mean, I don't think that it's ridiculous. I mean, at the very beginning of this, all I was saying was, I don't understand why people are convinced. And so that I did not mean for that to mean I think you're ridiculous. I legitimately don't understand why people are convinced by that. But like, so does the fact that Mark used Paul to inform his gospel, like, does that doesn't factor in? Like,
no, it does.
As far as
it does. No, it does. I just think we only have 7 letters.
Right.
I mean, we really don't have much on Paul. And I don't know if Paul gave a hoot about these details. Like, I don't know if he did. And if he didn't, we don't have the literature about him. We got 7 little scrawny letters that we're trying to like parse out and figure all this stuff out from. To me, it just seems much easier to think, hey, here's a guy. And they are also writing a gospel about him, just like Augustus has a gospel, or Julius Caesar has a gospel about him. And it's highly mythological. The difference is, here's this peasant from probably some location, either Galilee or who knows where. If you're assuming that, I mean, it depends on what you start with, right? So if you start with, here's some gospels, here's some literature that has this Jew from some backwater place, he's not going to leave a thumbprint in the sense of archaeological or historical evidence like a Caesar would, temples being built to him, etc., out the gate. But he is a form of a mystery cult develops from this guy, just like the Qumran sect. We don't have a single damn thing about this teacher of righteousness. We have no reason not to think he didn't exist. And we also see implications in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They believed he was going to come back, resurrect from the dead and come back. So there's all sorts of evidence, and I think it depends on what you're looking at and how you're gleaning it. That's one of the reasons I started going, okay, the whole heaven stuff for me, like the over and over heaven stuff that is trying to explain, birth, crucifixion, death, the start of the movement, etc. I understand the movement. I know what the mythicist position says about it. To me, it made more sense that there was just a guy, right, who had an influence on a small cult movement. And it gets mythologized. That's how I saw this. It just like the Dead Sea Scrolls, teacher of righteousness community. And in this particular apocalyptic period, another thing that started getting me is looking at apocalyptic figures and seeing such an apocalyptic tone in the New Testament that the end is nigh, and they're superstitious as hell. I mean, it's like doomsday is any moment now and stuff like that. For me, that started making me think, here's this Jesus. They put in the mouth of a heavenly figure who's perfect and celestial, and it all fails, right? To me, it just made more sense that there was a historical guy who made these ideas that the end is nigh, and it fell.
I don't think that Paul thought that Jesus prior to his death was perfect. I mean, I think prior to his death, he perceived Jesus to be like made of Davidic flesh, so made of human flesh. But when he resurrected, it was into a sinless body, right? So which the future his resurrected body is the same as our future resurrection bodies and all this other stuff. I think that I think they were both bodies were flesh and blood, but I don't think that Paul saw Jesus as perfect necessarily. For that matter, I feel like that fails on a historicist point of view too, because this saying that, oh well, if he was created as a celestial and he was perfect, then how does it all make sense? Is that what you were saying?
Like, no, I think that perfect. Well, just simply put, many people were apocalyptic figures, historical people that were apocalyptic figures who made predictions about the end, and they failed. And I haven't seen one where there's a celestial figure that made apocalyptic predictions that failed, or is an analogy I can use. The closest thing I can use is the idea that an invented historical person, even though they weren't historical in recent times, from the time they're talking about, this is John Frum and the cargo cults, but that 2,000 year gap between the cargo cults and the idea of Christianity inventing a Christian Christ figure, like within 30, 40 years, to me, they did this stuff with heroes and figures like Hercules. And I know the Rank Raglan, analogies and all that fun stuff. I love that stuff, by the way. I use that material as a historicist just to point out, like, why do we believe Jesus is true? But I don't use it in the sense that to me, it's like that Camille Gregor argument where Camille talks about here in this recent situation, they invent this complete figure. It just makes more sense in my head that there was this guy and he made predictions and the end failed.
So am I to take this to mean that you think that like figures like Hercules and Osiris and Zeus were like real historical figures?
No. That's euhemerism, and I definitely don't. That was later Greeks who I think wrote that stuff. Even Herodotus talks kind of like that. Like he thinks that Salmoxis might have been a guy or whatever. Like, who knows? I mean, we don't know. They go so far back. We don't have any data to think they were. And there's even contrary data to think Hercules and these other figures didn't exist. What I'm saying is when we look at them, they're so far in the distant past. They're not 40 years. They're not 30 years. They're not 20 years. Like Paul might be writing within a decade to, after Christ's supposed death, burial, resurrection. Paul is writing not far from the time that you're looking at this and going, like, is Paul's Jesus in ancient history? Do you take the idea that you think that Paul's Jesus, when was he crucified? Like 300 BC, 1000 BC in his mind? When did Paul think that Jesus was crucified?
No, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't know when
you take
he thinks
Hebrews,
it happened.
he thinks it's at the end of the ages, which is in their time, which is right there. If you take Hebrews,
right. Well, I mean, right, but I don't know when he thought it was. I mean, I mean, I know one of the popular analogies is like UFOs. Okay.
My brother believes in UFOs.
Well, my point is that right there at the end of the 40s, like what was it, 1945? Mm-hmm. I think was the Roswell, or no, 1947, right? Was the Roswell?
I don't know, 40s, 50s.
Yeah.
Either way,
within 30 years of that, mm-hmm. like by the 70s, like less than 30 years. You have a full-blown conspiracy where a spaceship landed, the government took alien bodies away mm-hmm. and have been experimenting on them or doing something with them at Area 51. And it's just all this made-up stuff. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that the amount of time that would have elapsed between Paul and whenever Paul thought that this Jesus or this Christ did his thing, I really don't think that there's like the amount of time is really an argument against mythicism, because considering that you've got Philo in the early first century who identifies this archangel figure that sounds a lot like how Paul would describe Jesus, it seems more probable to me that other Jews at the time were also finding this archangel figure that's pre-existent mm-hmm. to all of this, and is morphing that figure into this Christ figure that has been foretold for hundreds of years.
I think
that he's going to do these things.
Dude, I think we're on the same page in many ways. I really do. I mean, while you don't think there was a guy that was mythologized, like mm-hmm. I am with you. All of this stuff you're describing works with minimal historicity, though. Like, it doesn't demand that there wasn't a figure here at the basis that was mythologized. That's all I'm saying. And you can say, well, I don't need the minimal history. My model with mythicism works, and I get it. And I'm not here to convince you otherwise. I'm just saying, like, we are talking about the same things. I agree. You have these wild archangels. Here's Enoch. Enoch is this like celestial figure who ascends. Well, he really is a human on earth, but then he ascends, and then he's seated at the right hand of God. Like, he literally is seated on the right hand of God. Well, I mean, we know that Enoch didn't write Enoch. This is later. This is definitely pseudepigrapha, but I'm with you. Like, we're on the same page about all of that data. I'm just saying, like, I don't think they invented this guy whole cloth, just like Roswell. If we were to use that, like, not everything was invented. Sure, it was probably a weather balloon, and we were probably investigating sound waves from nuclear bomb blasts that were going on across the world, etc. You know what I mean?
But you see, I'm not saying that it was invented whole cloth. That's not what I'm saying.
I'm talking about the Jesus character, right?
Right.
That had put on flesh. When do you think he was made? When do you think he was created?
No, I mean, I don't know. I don't know. But what I'm saying is that I don't think that the story was made whole cloth. I think that this figure of Christ that Paul knows, at least, that Paul reveals to us in his writings, is the same figure that's been foretold for hundreds, if not thousands of years, but also that other Jews have identified in the Septuagint and the other, writings of the Old Testament to be this Christ figure that is supposed to absolve sins. Now, what information do we actually have? The earliest information, and that's Paul's information, given that he, whether he got his information from people on earth,
right,
or from visions and scripture only, I don't think that it really matters. I think what matters is that the only evidence that we have is Paul saying that he had visions of Christ, that is the same Christ described the exact same way as Philo describes Christ. And this Christ is, he considers the Lord, which Jesus, even if Jesus was a human on earth, he would have only attained that particular title once he resurrected.
Right.
So the only thing that Paul knows, at least seems to communicate to people that he knows, is this Lord figure of Christ. And so, considering all of that, I don't see a need to place a human person there in order for any of this to come about. Now, that doesn't mean that I think that it's unlikely or that it's not possible. I definitely think that it is, but I don't see the need. Like, I don't understand. Maybe we can end on this, because I know I've kept you very long.
Man, I'm having fun. That's all.
Yeah. But what's one piece of information that could only ever exist if Jesus was a historical figure? Because I don't see one piece of information that Paul gives us, or even that the Gospels give us, that could only exist if Jesus was a historical figure, or there was some man known as that was the Messiah and inspired Christianity.
Hold on, you're gonna have to rephrase this question, because what is one piece of evidence that Paul has that would be irrefutable for historians,
or the Gospels,
that would be irrefutable for historicism to be true and mythicism not to be true?
No. I'm just asking, like, from your point of view, could you name one piece of information that either the Gospels give us or Paul gives us that could only exist if Jesus was a historical figure?
That's a really, on the spot, that's very complex for me to even parse out. The fact that we have a difference of opinion on the Gospels and how we're approaching these Gospels, I think would be a necessary show at some point in the future to discuss differences in what we think about them. But if the guy has siblings, let's just say, if the guy was crucified, I would argue, right? If he's crucified and we were using this like the Gospels describe, You can't have mythicism if what the Gospels are saying in any way is anything of a kernel of what may have happened to a Jewish guy in the first century. You can't have, like, if you grant anything the Gospels say about Jesus' crucifixion, like, happening, I don't see how mythicism, or like how you could say there wasn't a guy. So you would have to say the Gospels don't count as evidence in any way, because, well, they're bad evidence. So if it's bad evidence, they're not good evidence at all. So you can't use them at all. You know what I mean?
I mean,
in
like,
the mythicist view.
Well, from one, like, there's the common Hitchens argument for the historical Jesus, and that's that, why would they, make up the two birthplaces? Like, why was he known as coming from Nazareth? That, and even Bart Ehrman, I believe, identifies this as being one of those true facts about Jesus.
Right.
So, like, saying that Jesus being connected to Nazareth as where he comes from, that must be a true fact about Jesus.
Yeah, I don't die on the hill of Nazareth. Okay. I don't die on the hill, even though I know the interpretation usually is a scriptural interpretation from mythicist point of view.
Right. Well, I'm sorry. I was just giving you an example of how I don't think that you have to discount the Gospels entirely, because, Nazareth is not known to Paul. That's not important to Paul, but it is something that's usually identified in the Gospels as being one of those quote unquote true facts about Jesus. And so
I think it's a fact that Jesus was crucified. I think Paul, when he says crucifixion, I think he means what Mark writes. I don't think the whole gospel Mark is this parable, analogy, allegory. I think there's a kernel here that Jesus was actually crucified. In some way he was killed here on earth. That's something I think is a fact, even though, like, I don't have a dog in this fight, so to speak, at the end of the day. I just think that there's a historical kernel that here's a Jew who thinks the end's going to happen soon. It's completely speculative to go and run down these rabbit trails, even though it's an interesting hypothesis that scholars built to go, okay, first he was in Galilee, but then they have him come from here. Or he says, don't go to Galilee here. Then it says, no, go to Jerusalem here in the later Gospels. Why are they not wanting him to go to Galilee? Why do they have him born in Bethlehem instead of here? Like, all of that's fun. I love entertaining my mind, listening to scholars come up with this stuff. But to me, if we have Paul say he was crucified, if we had, and this is my request from mythicist, if we have data, evidence, contemporaneous literature, I'll give it a few centuries either direction, BCE or CE, that shows any type of Jewish literature where people and figures are crucified in heaven and not on earth. Like, dude, that's the one that started to turn the data for me to start investigating and opening my mind and going, hold on. Like, we have countless literature of Jews being crucified for real by the Romans. We have countless literature that just talks about these accounts over and over and over. And I'm like, well, if there's 1,000 mentions of Jews being crucified in literature before and after the Gospels, it's not hard to think, here's a guy who was crucified, just like it's accounted in the contemporaneous literature surrounding it. And that started to make me go, maybe there's a guy. Maybe there's a guy here. And I just started to go, maybe. Notice I say maybe. I'm not a dogmatist here, man. You know what I mean? But I think there was probably a guy.
I don't know. I feel like requiring such a hyper-specific thing is a bit arbitrary. You
got 7 letters, though, John. 7 letters is so little, and it's not enough for me.
Hold on. But I mean, if you consider the culture that was surrounding Paul and the other Christians at this time, and considering that Paul would have been educated in pagan schools,
right, or at least know something of them, yeah,
right. And the fact that the Isis and Osiris cult and other mystery cults had deaths and burials and resurrections happening in the celestial realm or in the celestial planes or whatever. I mean, it's hard for me to require such a hyper specific thing.
Well, that is the one thing Bart Ehrman, for example, says, right? He's like, if there's one thing we can know about Jesus, he was crucified. Here's a Jew who gets crucified, right? So if we're going to tackle that very simple, basic request of like, here's a Jew who gets crucified. We have plenty of Jews who gets crucified. we need to go through and parse out all of the cases in history, right? And Richard Carey does this on the historicity, where he shows crucifixions. But even in that literature, when I'm reading stuff like Inanna and other things I'm trying to read up on, I don't see it necessarily happening in heaven either. So here is this Inanna figure who's stripped naked and ridiculed. And in my top 10 Dying and Rising God story that I did, it's based on Richard Carey's article. Like I love that article. Richard's brilliant. But I must admit, like, it's kind of like, well, here is this what he's calling crucifixion, because remember, Richard Carey defines crucifixion as not just like a person that's staked up on a wood or is on a like T-shaped cross. Any death that could require like hanging or hooking or nailing to a rock, or you name it. There's all sorts of ways in which he has that definition for crucifixion mean. And I'm simply saying, like, I think Paul thinks what Philo and Josephus, who are sandwiched right there contemporaneous with Paul, is Philo, and here is Josephus. And they're using this term the same way I think that Paul's using it when he says, and he was crucified. I just think that makes more sense for me. But, you know, you don't have to. I think it does.
Well, no, I mean, I think that I think that I definitely think that Paul is referring to, like, you know, I mean, Paul literally says the cross, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I do think that he's referring to that, what people were generally crucified on at that time. I think that he had that kind of imagery, but I feel like it's quite arbitrary to require an example of Jews thinking that crucifixions were happening in the heavens.
I would like any contemporary examples, any contemporary to the first century, where we have explicit statements where there is this demigod, hero, or godlike figure who is in heaven that gets crucified. That, I mean, we can be very vague, any type of death that may have happened and stuff, I guess, but it just, that's where I was saying the Gospels are a different question that we have to bring in, because sorry,
go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I was trying to, we're getting excited. We're like for me, it's like, here's the gospel saying it was these Romans really blame the Jews, right? Here's these Jews who reject Christ. Paul continuously says the Jews rejected Christ, right? So they build on this Pauline idea in Mark, but they say he was crucified. And they don't put it in heaven. I don't. Why did the Gospels? Why didn't they just keep it in heaven? I mean, why didn't the Gospels just say, "Okay, we're going to write a myth since we're already writing mythology here. Let's just write it about heaven and make it all in heaven instead of here on earth with real like stuff going on that we can actually look at and test and like go, okay, hold on, there's a region here, here's a place, and it's not like something that's going on up in the sky. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, why didn't the Old Testament keep Eden in the third heaven rather than have it here on earth?
I think the Old Testament probably already had it on earth. That's the thing. Eden may have.
Well, then why does Paul think that Eden was in the third heaven?
Because first of all, like the evolution of thought within Jewish thinking, by the time you get down to the first century, there's all sorts of lore. They're filling in the gaps. They're making up stuff about scripture that isn't even there by then. So it wouldn't shock me at all. Like if we look at the book of Jubilees, they're rewriting Exodus and Genesis. They literally rewrite scripture, which tells us that the canon wasn't even in existence at this time. So boo to those who think that the Bible is already a compilation. But if you look at it, yeah, Genesis seems to be a location on earth, which God makes Adam out of this earth, the dust of the earth, and he tills the land and then he populates the earth. It's later Jewish thinking and Second Temple Judaism that I think starts to do all these wild things that Carrier's talking about that is going on, which opens the possibility for this idea of celestial this and celestial that kind of stuff. That's why I think
I'm fairly certain that the Jews considered the celestial realm like as a physical place.
I'm not denying that at all. No, I just think that it's later material that we start to see these interpretations and these ideas float around. We're not finding, like in the Bible itself, Genesis, the Adam and Eve and the Eden account, or any account within the Tanakh that we see as old scripture, none of them place Eden outside of this realm that we live on earth. They're not like saying, hey, this is up here in heaven. It's later Jewish. I think after Hellenism or after Persia, something, they get these ideas and they start to do crazy stuff with scripture. That's what I think is going on. And it still doesn't like discredit mythicism. In fact, your question has no bearing on mythicism in this case, because all I'm saying is Paul could have thought celestial, but Genesis itself, I don't think is placing Eden in the heaven, in like the third heaven.
Okay. Well, as far as let me go back to the crucifixion thing, like being in heaven and whatever. Mm-hmm. I feel like the method of death or the method of execution is a product of syncretism, right? Okay. And so why, if it is a product of syncretism, then why would Jews, Paul or whoever, choose crucifixion for that for their Savior's death, right? And in order to explain that, you have to understand how the Old Testament predicts this suffering and dying Messiah figure that absolves sins, and given that there's this understanding that this Messiah figure would be, like cursed or whatnot, or put to a shameful death, I feel like putting him on a cross or having him crucified works well with the understanding of crucifixion and that kind of method of execution in a Jewish context, because you hear from apologists all the time, like, well, they wouldn't have if Jesus. I can't remember how they formulate it, but they basically say that they wouldn't have worshipped a shamed and dead Messiah. Basically, is what they say, and but I think that under the understanding of the method of execution in the heavens being crucifixion works well with the understanding of who the Messiah was supposed to be, and the understanding of what crucifixion meant to the Jews. Mm-hmm. And so the actual crucifixion part is a product of syncretism, while the fact of the Messiah or the Savior dying in the celestial realm, being buried there and resurrecting to bring about some kind of change that is the point of the religion, I guess specifically that's to bring everlasting life or to provide everlasting life. I mean, that was all over the mystery cults at the time. Like that basic skeletal structure was there. It was there in Isis and Osiris. I can't think of the other.
A death in some sense. And yeah, there's some resuscitation or resurrection that takes place in all of these mystery religions or cults. Yeah, I'm with you. And it still doesn't take away that there was possibly a historical kernel, is my point. And I think that when you're saying that there is this syncretism with this crucifixion, I think you're right in saying, like, hey, here's this guy. He fits the criteria for the suffering servant in Isaiah 53. He fits this criteria in the scriptures of what we were hoping and expecting to happen. But so did like the teacher of righteousness who dies out of nowhere, or Simon Bar Kokhba, or like other figures who die and they're seen as messiahs because here's this guy who's supposed to accomplish things. What makes Christianity or Jesus so unique? And I think what it is that it survived. It didn't go extinct like other cults, like other following movements with people who have these.
Right. Where I'm coming from on this is, what evidence do we have that says a person was needed for any of that to come about? Well, what's one? If I could just find one fact in early Christianity, either from Paul's work or even the Gospels, any of that information, if there's one piece of evidence that cannot be explained by mythicism.
Okay. So I see what you're trying to ask the question now. I see where you're coming back. Yeah. Well, John, if we're going to be honest, apologists, when you pin them down on the contradiction, can you name one contradiction that an apologist does not have a way out of, or tries to somehow gymnastically find a way to explain their way out of that particular argumentation? When I interviewed Bart Ehrman one time, I tried to.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, like, I try to get him to deal with these supposed contradictions that a Christian apologist was trying to say aren't contradictions. By the end of the episode, Bart just said, and he's right. He said, if you try hard enough, you can make anything. You can wiggle out of anything. And this is why I'm saying, like, when you said right before you got to this end part and you said, like, well, what piece of evidence do we have that we would need a guy? It's not about needing a guy, so to speak. To me, it's just most people exist. And I would love to do a chart, not a rank Raglan chart. I would like to do a chart on people who did miracles, people who were worshipped or deified, who had apotheosis, that were actual people that experienced these things, and then put it next to non-existent figures throughout history and do a comparison and see. I bet you there's more historical people who took on these deified forms and apotheoses and whatnot than there are non-historical. But don't take me to the bank on that. We need to do a chart on that, because I know that Richard Carrier talks about these deified figures that have a rank Raglan comparison to Jesus. I'm interested in, let's get every single person who spit in mud, like we see Vespasian, who spits in the eyes, not in mud, but I think he spits in the eyes of one of his people in the Serapean temple. He steps on a withered hand and he heals them. He's doing these miraculous deeds, and he's like a deity who becomes deified. We know they existed. All I'm saying is it's not like, do you need to have a person? People exist. People were crucified. People did these things. That just seems more plausible. It's the mythology, I think, that throws this curveball, and Paul's lack of communicating, here, this geographical location, here's a sibling, here's exactly what Jesus died because the Romans, and he shouldn't have said this, but he did, or whatever. That would be awesome if we had that information. We don't have it. We have this religious guy who's communicating theology, who believes that he is living at the brink of the edge of human history. He thinks the end is going to happen at any moment. And I'm with you in this, like, highly questionable, like, why doesn't Paul talk about these things? And we can get out of that, right? You might think it's a cop-out for historicists to say, well, Paul's not concerned about this or that. And you can say, well, you wiggled out of it. If I were to say crucifixion, you might say, well, syncretism, we know there are mystery cults that have dying and resuscitated figures, maybe not at the hands of Romans on an actual cross, but they had a form of death where they resuscitated and whatnot, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you could find a way to try and get out of it. It just doesn't seem implausible to me. It seems like it's normal to think there was probably a guy.
Well, so as far as your list goes, I think what you need to do is only pare it down to, like, I guess, I would pare it down to figures that aren't like rulers and stuff that were prone to have those mystical or mythological things built up about them, because that's not the minimal historical Jesus. Mm-hmm. The minimal historical Jesus, some unknown itinerant rabbi that caused a lot of ruckus and then got mythologized. Right. How many of those motherfuckers are in history?
Right. No, I'm with you. But it is Christianity. This is the weird thing about this, what we call Christianity, is while it's a Jewish original thing, it goes beyond Jews. And in fact, we know that pagans in the Greco-Roman world were interested in monotheism. God-fearers coming out of the woodworks to synagogues were interested in weird stuff like this. So here are these gospels. I am more akin to thinking the gospels were written by educated, most likely, in my opinion, either aristocratic type Jews or the elites in a Greco-Roman era. I honestly think the gospels are written by highly sophisticated people who wrote this stuff. I don't think these are just peasants.
No, definitely not. Because I mean, the Gospels, being written in Greek, I mean, they would have had to have attended the pagan schools where they taught Greek and all this other stuff. So, I mean, they were definitely educated on some level. And
I just see the model of Augustus, bro. Like Augustus, I know he's a leader figure. I get it. But the gospel authors, I think, are writing epics. They're writing kind of like it's kind of like a poetic epic about this Jesus figure, just like Augustus. We just don't have all of this other data. We got highly theological literature we're trying to sift through to figure out, what did he do? What did he say? Who was the guy? And I think if Paul says he was crucified, and I see the Gospels say and even narrate to some degree like what may or may not have happened, and they can't even agree necessarily, but that this Jewish rabbi might have tried to cleanse the temple and he ends up getting killed for this. or he may have said some things like, I may be a king, or Jews are saying about him, here's the next king of Israel. Well, damn it, you're not going to stay alive very long in the Roman imperial, state under this kind of condition and say you're a king. I don't know what really caused his death. I'm saying these are what the Gospels indicate. That doesn't seem implausible to me. I do think that the Jesus movement. Sorry.
Go ahead.
No. I paused a little long and then you started.
Well, but I mean, don't you think that some secular historians would have recorded some Jewish guy that got too big for his britches and called himself king?
I mean, that's possible, and we may have had historians write, and that may have been there. For all we know, that could have been in some of the histories that we've lost, as Richard Carrier talks about. So now we're getting outside into did Josephus really write this or that? And we're not going there because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter.
Right. So. And I mean, I've kept you here way longer than originally intended.
Well, dude, you're a patron of mine and I'm a fan of what you do. So the least I could do is come hang out.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I really appreciate you hanging out with me, talking to me about this kind of stuff. And I'm still hung up on the fact that there's no even just one piece of evidence that that could only ever exist if there was a historical Jesus. And I really don't see the failures of mythicism like you're at least that I think that you seem to think mythicism fails at. Mm-hmm. But I can, the only thing I can do is keep pursuing people to try to explain it to me, and maybe one day it'll just snap for me. I don't know, but right now,
John, you gotta go and pray about it, brother. Pray about it.
I know. I gotta pray. Suck that Jesus dick.
Oh God.
Anyways, but like I said, I've kept you long enough. I want you to tell everybody where they can find you and everything like that. And everybody needs to listen and go and subscribe to Myth Vision.
First of all, thank you, John, for your time and spending this amount of time talking with me. It's been a blast. I have a channel, Myth Vision Podcast, where I talk about this stuff, but it's not so much this stuff so much anymore, as much as it is I'm exploring all sorts of other areas, and I continue to do so. John is a really good friend, and I always appreciate what he does. So if you want to come subscribe. If you want to check out the Patreon, you can. I do work full time. That helps me do what I do. I also take requests for academics. Like if you're interested in me interviewing a scholar, you have questions, you want to talk to me in private, those are ways to do that as well. It keeps me doing what I'm doing here full time. You'll probably see John on my channel again in the future. I got to set up a debate between him and someone else. He does so many debates. I don't know why I haven't had him on to debate someone else. So that's the number one ways of supporting is through the YouTube and the Patreon, so that I can keep bringing you information from all sorts of areas. And as you can see, I hope I'm not dogmatic. I try to just come from where I think I am right at the moment. I also know that I've not always been right, so I could be wrong. And I think that's a good philosophy to be a student. Always try to learn and not be too dogmatic. So thank you.
No, yeah, I totally agree with that. And I too could be wrong about my mythicism, which I know that you probably think that I am, but that's what
I'm not going to say that. I think we're looking at evidence a little different, and how you're viewing it versus how I'm viewing it. That's why we're concluding different ways. It's like the whole prior probability. Mm-hmm. Whatever you put into that calculator and you factor that in, it's going to come out at the end in a certain direction. That's all.
Yeah, I can agree with that. But I think that it's what do you select for the probabilities?
Right.
That's where the real discussion is. Why is this more probable than that? And that's where that's where I find the discussions pretty interesting. But if you guys will, please go over to Myth Vision, subscribe, become a patron. If you can become a patron over there. And I guess we will see you heathens later. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.